Welcome to Tom's True Crime. Today, we take you to Newark, Ohio, 30 miles east of Columbus. January 27, 2001, 4:50 on Saturday morning. A neighbor of 21-year-old Brian Devey made a harrowing call to 911. The neighbor heard gunshots, heard Brian pleading for his life. When Newark police arrived on the scene minutes later, they found Brian lying on the sidewalk outside his apartment. He had been beaten very severely, and there was a gunshot wound to his face. Despite the efforts of EMTs on the scene, Brian did not make it. As paramedics packed up, investigators at the crime scene began looking for clues that might indicate what had happened in the moments before Brian was beaten and shot. In a case like the Devey murder, the crime scene is very important. Other than the fact that Brian had been both beaten and shot, the investigators had little else to go on. There were witnesses who lived next door who said that they had heard some noises, but they were not able to identify anything that had happened, which meant that the only option for the investigators was to try and retrace Brian's final steps and interview the last people to see him alive. A list would include 23-year-old Linda Clasper. Born in 1977, Linda Clasper grew up in a working-class Newark family. Her father worked in a factory growing up, and her mom was always at home with her children. She cooked and made sure the children went to school. She was there for her children. Linda was a sweet little girl, had a lot of friends she played with. She was a good girl, never caused any trouble. She is one of 4 daughters. Linda had no problem standing out in a crowd. She was outgoing, got involved with sports, and was on the swimming team. However, it wasn't just athletics and cheerleading that made Linda's school years memorable. She got pregnant when she was 16. Linda gave birth to a girl and never finished school. She stayed home taking care of her baby until she got old enough, and then she got a job at Walmart. For the next few years, Linda and her boyfriend had 2 more children, but the relationship eventually ended. They were not compatible, never married, and they went their separate ways. Linda was left to support her family on her own. She got a full-time job at a local factory, worked on the assembly line for TVs. After a few years, the company was sold and the factory shut down. Newark faced significant economic challenges around that time because of its reliance on manufacturing jobs that were affected by broader economic shifts, including globalization and changes in industry. Residents often struggled with economic stability. Traditional manufacturing bases had begun to decline, leading to job losses and economic uncertainty. Some people have lived in Newark all their lives, so they would never leave. Some people want to get out. Newark has its fair share of crime. By 2001, 23-year-old Linda Clasper was struggling to get by. She was taking care of her children and working part-time. She was barely getting by. Her sisters faced even tougher obstacles because they had trouble with the law. Despite that, Linda remained close to her siblings. On the evening of January 26, 2001, they got together at her sister's house in Johnstown, a small community 20 minutes from Newark, to hang out and catch up. They were at a party at her sister's, and they had a few friends over there that night. One of those friends was 21-year-old Brian Devey. Born in Minnesota, Brian and his family moved when Brian was a teenager to Newark, his mother's hometown. His mother was struggling to raise her children in Minnesota. Unfortunately, the family didn't leave their struggles behind. While Brian's single mother worked multiple jobs to support the family, young Brian took over cooking the family meals and soon showed a flair for it. He loved to cook. When he graduated high school, his passion for food took him to culinary school in Columbus. He went to Columbus and wanted to eventually manage a restaurant. So, he went to college in Columbus. It was a shock to the family that he was going to go away because none of them had ever been away from home. Despite Brian's ambition, he would not stay there long because the family could not afford it. Brian went back to Newark. Back home, Brian took a job to make ends meet, but his dreams of being a chef slipped further and further away. He worked in the factory for a little while. He struggled a little bit. He wasn't bitter about the disappointment. People describe him as a sweet, kind-hearted person and would do anything for you. While he had only been in Newark for a few years, he had built a strong support network of friends, which included Linda Clasper's cousin. Brian Devey had gone to a school with Linda's cousin, and that's when Linda first met Brian Devey. On the evening of January 26th, Brian and Linda's cousin dropped by the party at Linda's sister's house in Johnstown. They were drinking beers, socializing, talking about life, and having fun. Everything was fine. However, despite the good time, Brian Devey was eager to get back to Newark, where he was supposed to meet up with some friends for a belated birthday toast. His birthday was January the 8th, and he was having a celebration out and about in Newark. So around 10 o'clock that evening, Linda's cousin drove Brian Devey the 12 miles back home to Newark, and Linda tagged along. Brian arrives at the bar and celebrates with his friends. They ended up continuing the party back at Brian's apartment. But the mystery of what happened in the final hours of that night would raise questions for years to come and be the central missing piece in a murder investigation. It was around 4:30 on the morning of January 27, 2001, when a neighbor of 21-year-old Brian Devey made a harrowing call to 911. A neighbor heard gunshots, heard Brian pleading for his life. And when Newark police reached the scene minutes later, they found Brian lying on the sidewalk outside his apartment. He had been beaten very severely, and there was a gunshot wound to his face. And by the time the paramedics arrived, Brian had died from his injuries. While the paramedics packed up and left, the crime scene investigators went to work searching for any clues that might shed some light on why Brian had been killed. Almost immediately, the investigators found something that might be significant. In one pocket, Brian had 2 small packets of marijuana. The investigators found more incriminating evidence when they went inside the apartment. There was drug paraphernalia in his home. Was Brian's death the result of a drug deal gone bad? There had to be a reason for him being beaten and shot, possibly a drug transaction. Unfortunately for the investigators, there were no eyewitnesses who had seen what happened. Even the neighbor who called 911 admitted that she was too afraid to look out the window or dial 911 until after she heard a car door slam and tires squealing as it sped off. However, while the neighbor couldn't identify the killer or the getaway car, she did have some additional information for the investigators. She told them that Brian had people over prior to his death. The reports were that he was at a party and then later come home, and some of the people came to his home. And according to the neighbor, the murder occurred only a few minutes after the party broke up. From witness statements, the last partygoers from his party left his house around 4 a.m. Could one of the party guests be the killer? The neighbor said that she hadn't noticed any trouble prior to the shooting. Everything seemed fine. He was having a good time. There wasn't any problems. Brian's mother told police that her son was not a troublemaker when she arrived on the scene later that morning. The investigator tracks down and talked to everyone who had been seen with Brian the night before and hoped for a lead. They did not know who might have been involved. One of the people Brian Devey had come into contact with that night was 23-year-old Linda Clasper. Friends had told investigators that Linda and Brian had been seen earlier that evening partying. When they knocked on Linda's door that afternoon, all the investigators were hoping for was an insight into Brian's movements in the hours prior to his murder. Investigators were working through a list of people who had been seen with Brian that evening. This interaction with Linda was supposed to be another routine interview. But that all changed as soon as Linda came to the door. It appears there is blood on her clothing. She had dirt on her, she had a black eye, and she had a broken toe. The blood and dirt immediately led the investigators to an inescapable conclusion. They have to take a closer look at Linda Clasper. Based on her appearance, investigators asked her to come down to the station. Officer Everding told Linda Clasper that she was coming with him, that there was a crime committed last night, a murder. Linda said, "I'm not going anywhere." Linda's refusal to cooperate triggered a stern response from the investigators. Officer Everding threatened her. "Either you come with me now for questioning, or I'm going to the local magistrate to get a warrant." Facing possible arrest, Linda Clasper accompanied the officers to the Newark police station. Once there, Linda explained to the police that she had seen Brian Devey the night before his murder. He was with Linda's cousin. They were hanging out and were drinking. Linda said that she and her cousin had last seen Brian at around 10 o'clock when they dropped him off at a bar in Newark. But if that was the last time she saw Brian, the investigators wanted to know how she'd ended up bloody and bruised. According to Linda, the fight that she had been in occurred after she had dropped off Brian and she returned to Johnstown. Her story is she was brutalized by an ex-boyfriend. She's got a broken toe. She walks with a limp. She got a black eye. She got blood all over her shirt. Was she telling the truth? There was one way to find out. Investigators asked for Linda's clothing. They wanted to determine if the blood on her clothing was Brian's or not. Would the forensics exonerate Linda? It would take time to get the results. So that night, after sending Linda home, the investigators reviewed the results of Brian's autopsy. It revealed that the gunshot wound to his face had passed painfully but harmlessly through his cheek. The gunshot wound was not lethal. The critical cause of death was a significant blunt force trauma. Brian Devey had been beaten to death. Or was it possible he had been kicked to death? Linda had a broken toe. It was too coincidental. And when the analysis of Linda's clothes came back from the crime lab, the mud on her garments added another unlikely coincidence. It's consistent or similar to the dirt that was found outside of Brian's apartment. But while the mud on Linda's clothes put her the crime scene, would the blood analysis make the case complete? As it turned out, the blood on her clothing was not Brian's. It did not implicate Linda. The blood matched her ex-boyfriend's DNA, just as Linda had claimed. The investigators were shocked to find out that the blood on Linda's clothing did not match Brian. It appeared to confirm that alibi and that Linda was not involved in the case at all. It looked as if the investigators' only lead had turned into a dead end, but new evidence would soon surface that would take the case in a stunning new direction. By October 2002, it had been nearly 2 years since 21-year-old Brian Devey had been beaten to death outside his Newark apartment. The case went cold because there wasn't any indication of how he ended up dead in his yard. Initially, the investigators suspected that 25-year-old Linda Clasper had been involved. Someone had come to the Newark police station and said they saw these people together. And when they found Linda the next morning still wearing bloody clothes, she became their prime suspect. But then the test results came back from Linda's clothes. They tested it, and lo and behold, it was not what the investigators thought or hoped it would be. The source of it was an ex-boyfriend that she'd gotten into a skirmish with that evening. It seemed as if Linda was off the hook, and police were back at square one with no leads on Brian's killer. The police have a lot of public pressure with people saying that they don't feel safe until you find this person. Was it possible something had happened between the time that Linda and her cousin dropped Brian off at the bar around 10 p.m. and 4:30 that next morning, when Brian was killed, something that had led to murder? Brian's family was not convinced that Linda Clasper should be cleared just yet. They thought Linda Clasper was involved from day one. But would Brian's family be able to prove Linda was involved? The family thought something would come out eventually, because it's a small town. They thought maybe people would start talking about it. In October 2002, more than a year and a half after the murder, someone finally did. The person who talked was 35-year-old Anderson Edwin Bish. Anderson Bish was an ex-boyfriend of Linda's, but he was not the ex-boyfriend who she had gotten into a fight with on the evening of the murder. According to Anderson Bish, Linda had confessed to killing Brian one evening to him. Had the investigators been right about Linda all along? Anderson Bish's story seemed to back it up, but they needed more than the word of a convicted criminal. In fact, when Anderson Bish reached out to the investigators, he was sitting in the county jail on burglary charges. Jailhouse snitches are looking for something. Sometimes they are telling the truth, but investigators are always leery. What the investigators needed was something to confirm Anderson Bish's story. They had no physical evidence tying her to it, or did they? After Anderson came forward claiming that Linda had confessed, the investigators went back over the case file and found something they had previously overlooked in the autopsy photos of Brian's body. On Brian Devey's hand, there was a bite mark, and it was sent away for analysis with a dentist. It may have been missed during the first autopsy. Could it be the evidence the investigators needed to confirm Anderson Bish's confession story and link Linda to the murder? In early 2003, 2 years after Brian Devey's murder, investigators were back on Linda's doorstep. Investigators asked Linda to provide dental impressions in the hopes of confirming who made the bite marks on Brian's body. Will comparing the dental impressions to the bite mark be another bust like the bloodstains on Linda's clothing? In May of 2003, the crime lab came back with its results. It was a match. Since the identity of the bite mark appeared to confirm the information provided by their jailhouse snitch, the investigators were finally convinced they had found Brian's killer. Not long after receiving the lab results in August of 2003, investigators got another break in the case when an inmate at the county jail contacted the investigators and claimed to have information about Brian's murder. The informant, who just happened to be locked up in the county jail, was an old friend of Linda's, named Robert Bizant. And a month earlier, in July of 2003, while Robert was in a county jail on burglary charges, he had allegedly talked to his cellmate about Brian Devey's murder and Linda Clasper. He's in jail. He says she did it. He was there. He saw it. Here's what happened. Robert said he was in the car the night that Brian Devey died. Robert Bizant said that evening he was out at the bar and he said he was drinking and having a good time. But according to what Robert told his cellmate, as he left the bar later that night, he ran into Linda. Linda pulled up and said, "Hey, get in. I need to talk to you." And allegedly, when Linda pulled up outside the bar to speak to Robert that night, she was already sporting a black eye. Linda told him, "Hey, there's somebody that put their hands on me." And according to what Robert told his cellmate, that someone was Brian, he hit her, is what she said. There was some indication that she may have had a fight with him earlier in the day. And it was a fight that Linda apparently aimed to finish. According to what he'd allegedly told his cellmate, Robert had gotten into the car with Linda, and together they'd driven to Johnstown. Robert Bizant's story was he picked up a couple of guys who were still unidentified. After that, Robert, Linda, and the two men had allegedly driven to Brian's apartment. Linda, as Robert tells it, walked up to the door, lured him out. And when Brian came downstairs with Linda, her two friends were waiting in ambush. Then they beat him with a baseball bat and a crowbar, and they beat Brian to death. All while Linda watched. It was far more damning than Bish's claim that Linda had confessed to killing Brian. Robert was not only a witness, he was a participant. He was someone that could give the jury a direct account of just how Brian died. But could the investigators and prosecutors get him to cooperate? When the investigators went to the jail and confronted Robert with his cellmate's story, he denied the whole thing. Did that mean the cellmate's story wasn't true? Not necessarily. Over the next few weeks, several of his friends, including his own mother, told investigators they had heard him say the exact same story. The fact that several people who knew Robert basically confirmed his cellmate's claims once again gave the investigators confidence in their jailhouse snitch. And on January 20th, 2004, the investigators drove back out to Linda's house, placed her in handcuffs, and told her she was under arrest for the murder of Brian Devey. Linda Clasper became upset and started crying. Brian's family was relieved that 3 years after the murder, the police had finally made an arrest. The family hoped that more arrests would follow. They thought she would give up the names of the other two people because she knew who they were. By April of 2004, 26-year-old Linda Clasper had spent 3.5 months in jail awaiting trial on murder charges. Linda was charged with orchestrating the death of 21-year-old Brian Devey, who had been beaten to death outside his Newark apartment in January of 2001. The case against Linda was a complicated one based on a single bite mark on Brian's hand and testimony from a series of informants and witness statements. The Newark police had a lot of conflicting stuff, and they're trying to piece it all together. The key to piecing it together was 22-year-old Robert Bizant. In February, he had also been arrested on murder charges after numerous people told the investigators that he had been with Linda on the night of the murder and helped her pick up the two men who had actually killed Brian. He is the one that, in the process of not only implicating Linda, implicates himself, and he says that he was part of this alleged conspiracy. Earlier, when confronted with what he had apparently told others about the crime, Robert had denied everything, but that changed once he was booked on murder charges. After his arrest, Robert finally broke down and told the investigators that his cellmate's story was true. He was involved in Brian's murder. Robert's decision to cooperate was a major break for the prosecutors, and they would need it because they would soon be short a witness. That April, at a pretrial hearing, the prosecutors put their first jailhouse informant on the stand. Linda's ex-boyfriend Bish. Bish was the boyfriend that claimed Linda had confessed to killing Brian. They brought him forward expecting him to implicate Linda in this crime, but instead, Anderson made a confession of his own. As it turned out, he shows up on that day, tries to take the Fifth Amendment, the court won't let him, and he ultimately recant his entire testimony. In the process of recanting, it looks down at the prosecution's table and says that the lead detective, is the one that told him what to say. And in fact, he goes so far to say, "I just wrote whatever he told me to put down." Confronted with Bish's bombshell allegations, the judge had no choice but to drop the charges against Linda. That demonstrates the weakness of the prosecution's case, but it was only a temporary reprieve. While Anderson had recanted his story, Robert Bizant remained in custody. In September 2004, when he pleaded guilty to conspiracy charges for his role in Brian's murder, he not only admitted that he had been present when Brian was killed, Robert confessed that he was more involved than he had originally let on. He has one hell of a story to tell. He says, "I shot Brian." He said he didn't mean to hit or shoot Brian Devey. He said he saw the beating going so bad, he tried to stop it, got out of his car, fired his weapon toward that area. And in all the confusion, Robert said that he accidentally shot Brian. It looked like his confession was genuine. If he's not telling the truth, why is he willing to go to jail for it? Robert Bizant's confession was the break in the case that investigators had been waiting for. They had an individual who was there. Robert Bizant described the beating in detail, the gunshot and the getaway. On September 27th, 3 days after Robert pled guilty, the investigators were back on Linda's doorstep with a new arrest warrant charging her with Brian's murder. Linda parted with her children for a second time. How confident were the prosecutors in their case against Linda? With her trial date looming, they approached Linda with what appeared to be an incredible offer, a 2 to 4 year sentence, if she pleaded guilty and named her alleged co-conspirators. Linda had already spent almost 2 years in county jail at that point. So in essence, she could have been offered to be able to walk out that day or soon thereafter. Linda refuses the deal, no matter how much her court-appointed attorney tried to convince her to take it. Linda said she didn't do it, and she is not going to say she did. She absolutely believed in her innocence. It was April 3, 2006, more than 5 years after Brian's murder, when Linda finally stood trial. In the prosecutor's opening statement, she argued that Linda had been the mastermind who orchestrated Brian's murder. They said that she and Brian might have had a falling out, and she was upset. That's what Robert Bizant claimed when he took the stand for the prosecution. He indicated Linda Clasper was involved and that she wanted revenge because Brian Devey had struck her earlier. No one made him say anything that he didn't want to say. And then to build on Robert's testimony, prosecutors called Dr. Eric Blackshaw, a forensic odontologist and bite mark expert, to the stand. In his testimony, Blackshaw stated that the bite mark on Brian's hand was definitely Linda's. He also found that the bite mark must have occurred within several minutes of his death. It was powerful testimony. After 5 years, dogged by accusations that she was a killer, Linda took the stand to tell her side of the story to the jury. Linda said Brian Devey was dropped off at the bar where he was meeting with his friends, and that was the last time she had seen him. She said she was never at Brian Devey's house. Linda's impassioned testimony did little to sway Brian's friends and family. To them, she was guilty. When the jurors retired to consider their verdict on April 6th, Linda was confident. It took 4 hours into one day and 2.5 hours into the next day. When the jury came back, they found Linda guilty of murder. After waiting so long for justice, the verdict was an emotional moment for Brian's family. They were happy with the verdict. Linda, on the other hand, was shocked by the outcome. She said she could not believe it because she wasn't involved and they convicted her. She was devastated. There was no way she could overcome the evidence the prosecutors had presented to the jury. You had an eyewitness, not just an eyewitness. You had one of the perpetrators, and he was testifying about what role Linda Clasper had in it. And then the bite mark evidence. That was very strong evidence to convict her. After the verdict, the judge sentenced Linda to 15 to 30 years in prison. Linda felt nobody was listening to her. Brian's family said the sentence was too short. They said that Brian suffered a horrific death. It was a painful death, and those responsible should pay for that. They said 15 to 30 years is too short for premeditated murder. Linda maintained her innocence. She said she was confident. She felt it in her heart. She believed she was going home because she didn't do anything. Once in prison, she was determined to prove it. She got access to the law library, and she was determined to fight her case and educate herself on it. She begins to become her own lawyer, studying her case, obsessed with proving her innocence. And the result of all that study was a 70-page handwritten letter that she sent to government officials across the state of Ohio, arguing that the Newark Police Department had ignored dozens of witnesses and scientific evidence that supported her innocence. It was clear that she was very desperate to get her point across. She was calling it a fundamental miscarriage of justice. Her desperate calls for help went unanswered. She wasn't able to get representation for the appeals that she was making, and so she was having to do it on her own. As a result, Linda spent nearly a decade in prison. Her 3 daughters grew up and started families of their own. Then in 2014, her 70-page letter eventually found its way to the Ohio Innocence Project, whose staffers were surprised by what they read. They feel that Linda is a woman who is confident in her innocence and needs a voice. They started looking at the facts of the case and seeing that they just simply had the wrong target of their investigation since the beginning. When you add all of that up, you see an innocent woman that's lost a decade of her life. Determined to get justice for Linda, the Innocence Project took her case. Linda was hopeful. On October 1, 2015, 10 years after her conviction for the murder of Brian Devey, 38-year-old Linda Clasper was back in court preparing to make her case for a new trial. Since day one, the proper investigation was never done. The attorneys from the Ohio Innocence Project agreed with her. At Linda's 2006 trial, a forensic odontologist had testified that a bite mark found on Brian Devey's body matched dental impressions made from Linda's teeth. The state's expert on the bite mark, who was so sure about it 10 years ago now, says, "I misinterpreted the data. I was wrong." Brian's family was stunned by the reversal. They do not understand how a scientist can support one thing and then change his mind. The testimony was enough to convince a judge that Linda's case should be retried. But would Linda ever stand trial again? Because in 2016, when the prosecutors started preparing for the retrial, they ran into trouble when they reached out to Robert Bizant, the friend who had claimed he had ridden along with Linda on the night Brian died. Bizant's attorney said his client was going to plead the fifth. And the reason was obvious. According to Linda's attorney, he made the whole thing up. Robert Bizant had told investigators whatever they wanted him to say. He was looking for a deal, and it didn't matter who he hurt. He knew it was wrong, but the reality was he was willing to say whatever they wanted him to say to help himself. And with that, the entire case against Linda collapsed. The district attorney said they are just going to dismiss the charges. They don't have sufficient evidence to proceed. After 11 years behind bars, Linda could finally go home. Brian's murder remains unsolved. If Linda Clasper didn't kill Brian, his killer is still walking this planet free from this crime. This means, for now, all Brian's family can do is cherish his memory. They continue to hold out hope that justice will eventually come. This isn't over. One day, the truth will be out. It is finally over for Linda. Almost 40 and out of prison, she's making a fresh start. She is grateful and happy that the truth set her free and that she is home. She said that she has each moment to be grateful and thankful for. Linda Clasper has been fully exonerated for the murder of Brian Devey. Linda lives in Newark with her 3 daughters and 3 grandchildren. Brian Devey's murder remains a cold case. Thank you for joining us on this episode of Tom's True Crime. If you are interested in more in-depth investigations into the most perplexing crimes, be sure to like and subscribe to our channel. What are your thoughts about this case? Please share them with us in the comments below. Until next time, stay safe.